My mom's text woke me at 3 a.m. Your stepfather isn't who he says he is. Get your brother out now. I didn't hesitate. The phone screen lit up my bedroom ceiling with cold blue light, and I read the message 3 times before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. Mom had been on a nursing shift at the hospital since yesterday afternoon, wouldn't be home until 7 this morning, and she never texted during work unless someone was dying. The message violated every pattern of her careful, methodical communication style, which meant something had shattered her usual protocols completely. I was 19 and home from college for winter break, old enough to recognize when adults were overreacting versus when they were operating from genuine terror. This text radiated the kind of fear that came from discovering something so wrong it couldn't wait for morning explanations or careful conversations. My stepfather Greg had been part of our lives for 3 years, married to Mom for 18 months, and he'd always seemed aggressively normal in ways that made me vaguely uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. The discomfort felt petty and ungrateful considering he'd helped pay my tuition and treated my little brother Caleb with patient kindness that our biological father had never managed. I threw off my blankets and grabbed jeans from the floor, pulling them on while my mind raced through possibilities for what Mom could have discovered. Greg worked night security at a downtown office complex, supposedly making rounds and monitoring cameras from a desk job that seemed boring enough to be legitimate. Nothing about his daily routine suggested hidden criminal activity or secret double lives, but Mom wouldn't send this message unless she'd found something concrete and terrifying. I shoved my feet into sneakers without tying them and grabbed my phone charger and wallet, operating on instinct that told me we wouldn't be coming back here tonight. Caleb was 14 and slept like the dead, completely undisturbed by my frantic movement in the room across the hallway. His door was covered with band posters and gaming tournament flyers, normal teenage decoration that suddenly felt precious and fragile, like evidence of an innocence about to be destroyed. I eased his door open and found him buried under his comforter with headphones still in his ears, his phone screen casting a faint glow across his face where he'd fallen asleep watching videos. Waking Caleb quietly was nearly impossible under normal circumstances, but waking him with urgency while keeping him silent would require strategy I wasn't sure I possessed. I pulled one earbud out carefully and shook his shoulder, watching his eyes crack open with the glazed confusion of someone torn from deep sleep. Before he could speak or make noise, I put my hand over his mouth and leaned close to whisper directly into his ear. Mom sent an emergency message about Greg. We need to leave the house right now without him knowing. I'll explain everything once we're safe, but you have to trust me and stay completely silent. Caleb's eyes went wide with sudden alertness, the kind of instant wakefulness that fear produces, and he nodded against my palm. I released his mouth and handed him clothes from his closet, jeans and a hoodie that he pulled on over his sleep shirt with shaking hands. His phone had at least 70% battery, and I made him pocket it along with his earbuds, knowing we might need every resource available once we figured out where we were actually going. Greg's bedroom was downstairs at the end of the hallway near the back door, positioned so he could hear anyone coming or going, which I'd previously attributed to his security guard instincts rather than anything sinister. But now that detail took on new meaning, suggested someone who monitored the household with professional vigilance rather than normal parental awareness. The house was a split level built in the 80s, with bedrooms upstairs and living spaces on the main floor, which meant getting Caleb out required navigating stairs that creaked on every third step. My window faced the street with a drop onto concrete sidewalk that would definitely injure one or both of us. But Caleb's window looked out onto the back deck with a much shorter fall to grass. I pointed at his window and he nodded understanding, moving to open it with agonizing slowness while I stuffed his laptop and phone charger into my backpack alongside my own electronics. The window screen popped free with a soft click that sounded explosively loud in the silent house, and we both froze, listening for movement from downstairs that would indicate Greg had heard and was coming to investigate. Nothing stirred for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, and I gestured for Caleb to climb through first. He hesitated at the window ledge, looking down at the 8-foot drop to the deck below with visible reluctance. I gripped his wrists and lowered him as far as my arms would reach before letting go, and he landed with a thump that made me wince despite the relative softness of the wooden planks. I followed immediately, dropping and rolling to absorb impact, my shoulder connecting hard with the deck railing but holding my weight when I stood. Caleb was already moving toward the stairs that led down to the backyard, and I grabbed his arm to stop him, pointing instead toward the fence that separated our property from the neighbor's house. Climbing the fence would be quieter than descending the deck stairs, which were metal and would ring with every footstep. We scaled the 6-foot privacy fence together, Caleb boosting me first before I reached down to help pull him up and over. We dropped into the neighbor's yard and ran through their garden beds, crushing flowers that would probably get us yelled at under normal circumstances, but right now, normal circumstances were burning down behind us. We emerged onto a side street 3 blocks from our house, both of us breathing hard and looking back constantly to see if Greg had followed. No lights came on in our house. No figure appeared in the windows or doorway, which either meant he was still asleep or he was awake and choosing not to pursue us for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. I pulled out my phone to call Mom directly, needing more information than 3 sentences could provide, but her phone went straight to voicemail with the automated message saying she was unavailable. Hospital policy required nurses to silence their phones during shifts, which meant she'd sent that text during a break and had probably already returned to patient care where she couldn't answer personal calls. I tried texting instead, telling her we'd gotten out safely and asking where we should go, but the message showed as delivered without being read. Caleb was pulling on my jacket sleeve and demanding explanations I didn't have, his voice rising toward panic in a way that would definitely attract attention from anyone still awake at 3 a.m. I showed him Mom's original text and watched his face go through confusion, disbelief, and finally fear as the implications registered. What does she mean he's not who he says he is? What did she find out? His questions were the same ones spinning through my head, but I had no answers that wouldn't be speculation and guesswork. All I knew was that Mom had discovered something serious enough to warrant evacuation in the middle of the night, and her phrasing suggested Greg represented immediate danger rather than just disappointing revelations about his past. We were standing on a residential street at 3 a.m. with nowhere to go and no way to contact the one person who'd warned us to run. My phone buzzed with a new text, this time from Greg's number. "Where are you kids? I checked on you both and your rooms are empty. Bed's cold. Where did you go?" The message's tone felt wrong, too casual for discovering 2 teenagers missing in the middle of the night, like he was fishing for information rather than expressing genuine concern. A parent who woke to find children genuinely missing would call 911 immediately, would be frantic and terrified, wouldn't send casual text messages asking about locations. Another text from Greg appeared before I could decide whether to respond. "Your mom put some crazy ideas in your heads, didn't she? Whatever she said, she's having a breakdown. Work stress. She's been paranoid for weeks. Come home and we'll talk about getting her some help." The gaslighting was so textbook it would have been funny under different circumstances, trying to preemptively discredit Mom's warning by suggesting mental illness. But the attempt confirmed that Greg knew exactly why we'd run, which meant he'd either intercepted Mom's message somehow, or had been expecting this possibility, and had prepared responses in advance. Neither option suggested innocent misunderstanding. I kept thinking about how Greg always knew our schedules with uncanny accuracy, always seemed to be aware of where we were and what we were doing even when we hadn't told him directly. Behaviors I'd attributed to attentive parenting now looked like surveillance by someone with professional training in monitoring targets. Caleb grabbed my phone to read Greg's messages, and his face went pale even in the dim streetlight. "He's gaslighting Mom? That means she's right about whatever she found. We need to get somewhere safe before he figures out where we are." The nearest 24-hour location was a diner 4 blocks east, the kind of place that attracted third-shift workers and insomniacs rather than criminal activity. We walked quickly without running, trying to look purposeful rather than fugitive, constantly checking behind us for signs of Greg's truck. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Greg, each one escalating in tone from concerned to frustrated to angry. The progression felt calculated rather than organic, like he was running through a script designed to provoke specific responses. One message claimed he was calling the police to report us as runaways. Another said Mom had already been sedated at the hospital after a psychiatric episode and couldn't help us. The lies were getting more elaborate and desperate, which suggested our continued absence was disrupting whatever plans he'd made for tonight. The diner appeared ahead with fluorescent lights bleeding onto empty parking lot pavement, and we practically ran the final block to reach the safety of public witnesses and security cameras. Inside smelled like coffee and industrial cleaner, mostly empty except for a waitress refilling salt shakers and 2 construction workers in a back booth. We slid into a corner table with clear views of both exits and the parking lot, and I finally tried calling Mom again with the same voicemail result. Caleb was scrolling through his phone with increasing agitation, and when I asked what he was looking for, he showed me a news article from 8 months ago. Man arrested for identity theft and fraud, charged with assuming multiple false identities over 15-year period. The mugshot showed someone who looked similar to Greg but younger and thinner. Same general bone structure but different hair and no glasses. The name in the article was David Hutchins, arrested in Nevada after investigators discovered he'd been living under a dead man's social security number while running financial scams targeting divorced women with children. Caleb had found the article by searching for news stories about identity theft, combined with terms like stepfather and security guard, and the resemblance was too close to be coincidental. My hands shook as I read through the article details, learning that David Hutchins had a history of marrying single mothers, gaining access to their finances and their children's personal information, then disappearing with substantial funds once suspicion began developing. The pattern fit perfectly with how Greg had entered our lives, meeting Mom at a hospital charity event where she'd been volunteering, moving quickly from dating to engagement, insisting on joint accounts and financial planning that gave him access to everything. Mom had been so grateful to find someone stable after our father's abandonment that she'd missed or ignored warning signs that now seemed blindingly obvious. I zoomed in on the mugshot and showed it to Caleb, and we both agreed the resemblance was too strong to dismiss. This was Greg, or whoever Greg actually was, living under yet another stolen identity and targeting our family for whatever resources he could extract before moving on to his next victims. The realization made me nauseous with rage and fear, knowing we'd been living with a predator who'd been systematically positioning himself to destroy us financially and possibly physically if we became obstacles to his plans. The waitress approached our table with coffee pot and menus, and I ordered coffee for both of us while trying to appear normal despite the crisis exploding around us. She gave us a concerned look that suggested 2 teenagers alone at 3 a.m. registered as concerning, but she didn't ask questions, just poured coffee and left the menus before returning to her salt shaker project. I called the hospital's main line and asked for the emergency department where Mom worked, but the nurse who answered said she couldn't confirm or deny employee presence per privacy policy and wouldn't transfer calls to staff currently with patients. I explained it was a family emergency and we needed to reach our mother immediately, but hospital protocol was unyielding, and the nurse suggested calling back during regular hours when the administrative office could help locate employees. The bureaucratic stonewalling felt surreal given the circumstances, like being trapped in a nightmare where every system designed to help was instead creating barriers to survival. Caleb had continued searching and found more articles about David Hutchins, painting a picture of a sophisticated con artist who'd successfully operated across 6 states under various identities. One article mentioned he'd been released on bail pending trial and had subsequently disappeared, with authorities assuming he'd fled the country. But if Greg was actually David Hutchins, he hadn't fled anywhere, had instead created another identity, and continued his operations in a new state where nobody was looking for him. The bail had been posted 9 months ago, which aligned perfectly with when Greg had appeared in Mom's life, suggesting he'd used the bail period to establish his new identity before failing to appear for trial. I screenshotted everything and tried to figure out what to do with information that felt simultaneously crucial and useless, since local police would need time to verify identities and investigate claims, time we probably didn't have if Greg decided to eliminate problems before disappearing again. My phone rang with an unknown number and I answered cautiously, hearing a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "This is Detective Allison Cross with the County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling because your mother contacted us tonight with concerns about her husband's identity. She asked us to reach out to you and your brother to verify your safety. Can you confirm your current location?" The relief that flooded through me was so intense I almost cried, finally reaching someone with authority who believed Mom and could potentially help us. I gave the diner's address, and Detective Cross said she was sending a unit immediately, told us to stay in public view and not go anywhere with anyone claiming to be family or friends until deputies arrived. She explained that Mom had been researching Greg's background after finding discrepancies in documents he'd claimed were employment verification, had discovered evidence suggesting his identity was fabricated, and had contacted police before her shift started tonight. The department had been quietly investigating for the past 6 hours while trying to locate Greg without alerting him to their suspicions. But Greg had apparently realized something was wrong and had failed to show up for his supposed security shift, which had prompted Mom's urgent text to us. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within 15 minutes, entering the diner with hands near their weapons and eyes scanning for threats. They confirmed our identities by checking driver's licenses and asking verification questions about Mom that only we could answer, then separated us to take statements about everything that had happened since Mom's text. I walked them through the escape, the messages from Greg, the news articles Caleb had found, and the pattern of surveillance behaviors we'd noticed over the past year. The deputy taking my statement, a woman named Officer Ruiz, nodded grimly at several points and said that everything I described aligned with the profile of someone operating under false identity while grooming potential fraud victims. She explained that the man we knew as Greg Thornton had indeed been positively identified as David Hutchins through fingerprint databases after Mom had provided material with his prints to investigators. Warrants had been issued for his arrest on charges of identity theft, fraud, and bail jumping, with additional investigation pending into potential threats to our family. Officer Ruiz pulled out her tablet and showed me surveillance footage from our house that made my blood run cold. The detective team had placed cameras on telephone poles near our property after Mom's initial report, and the footage showed Greg loading boxes into his truck at 2 a.m, moving with purpose and speed that suggested he was preparing to flee. But what made me freeze was the timestamp showing this activity had started 30 minutes before Mom's text to me, which meant Greg had been actively evacuating before we'd even woken up. He'd known the investigation was closing in, had been preparing his escape, and if we'd still been asleep when he finished loading the truck, I had no doubt he would have done something to ensure we couldn't testify about his identity or activities. Officer Ruiz saw my face change and said quietly that Mom's timing with that text had likely saved our lives, that David Hutchins had been investigated but never charged in connection with 2 suspicious deaths of previous partners who'd discovered his fraud operations. Caleb was crying by the time the deputies finished with our statements, the full weight of betrayal and danger finally breaking through his composure. The man he'd trusted as a father figure, who'd taught him to change car oil and helped with his math homework, had been a criminal predator positioning himself to exploit or harm us. Officer Ruiz let him cry without rushing him, just sat quietly and offered tissues while explaining that reactions like this were completely normal when someone discovered a loved one wasn't who they claimed to be. She said they'd arranged for us to stay with Mom's sister in the next county until the situation was resolved, that Mom would be escorted home from the hospital by investigators who needed to secure evidence from the house, and that we absolutely should not return home until Greg had been located and arrested. The casual way she mentioned arresting him, like it was inevitable rather than hopeful, made me realize they had resources and jurisdiction I hadn't fully understood. that this wasn't just local police but multi-state task forces that had been tracking David Hutchins since his bail disappearance. Before we left the diner, Officer Ruiz received a call on her radio that made her expression go hard and serious. She stepped away to respond, and when she returned, she informed us that Greg's truck had been spotted heading south on the interstate, and Highway Patrol was coordinating a pursuit with assistance from multiple agencies. The situation was escalating faster than I'd anticipated, moving from investigation to active manhunt in real time. We rode in the back of a patrol car listening to radio chatter about Greg's location, hearing updates about roadblocks being established and helicopter support being deployed. The professional efficiency was both reassuring and terrifying, confirming that the threat Greg posed was serious enough to warrant this level of response. Caleb gripped my hand tightly while we listened, both of us processing that the man who'd been making us breakfast yesterday morning was now fleeing from police while potentially armed and definitely desperate. The pursuit ended 20 miles south when Greg attempted to exit the interstate and lost control on the off-ramp, his truck sliding sideways into a guardrail hard enough to deploy airbags and disable the vehicle. Radio chatter described officers approaching with weapons drawn, ordering the driver to show his hands and exit the vehicle slowly. There was a tense silence lasting almost a minute before the report came through that the suspect was in custody without shots fired, being transported to county jail pending federal charges. Officer Ruiz turned to look at us through the partition and said simply that it was over, Greg was arrested, and we were safe. The relief should have been immediate and complete, but instead I felt numb and hollowed out, like some essential part of my ability to trust reality had been permanently damaged by this experience. We arrived at Aunt Melissa's house just as sunrise started lighting the eastern sky with orange and purple streaks that felt inappropriate given the nightmare we'd just survived. Aunt Melissa met us at the door in her bathrobe with tears streaming down her face, pulling both of us into a hug that lasted long enough for me to start crying too. She'd been on the phone with Mom for the past hour getting updates and piecing together the full story, and she kept apologizing like she should have somehow known Greg was dangerous, should have seen warning signs that would have protected us. But predators like David Hutchins succeeded because they were good at mimicry, good at performing normalcy so convincingly that even trained professionals sometimes missed the deception. Mom arrived 2 hours later with 2 detectives, looking exhausted and furious and relieved all at once. She grabbed both of us and just held on, not speaking, just confirming through touch that we were solid and real and safe. The full story emerged over coffee and bagels that nobody really ate, just pushed around plates while Mom explained what she'd discovered. Greg had asked her to co-sign a business loan 2 weeks ago, claiming he wanted to start a private security consulting firm. The loan application had required detailed financial documentation, and while gathering statements, Mom had noticed irregularities in Greg's employment records. His supposed security company had no digital footprint, no business license, no tax records that should have existed for a company he claimed had employed him for 5 years. Further investigation revealed his social security number had been issued to someone who died in a car accident 8 years ago, and his driver's license was a sophisticated forgery that would pass casual inspection but failed verification through law enforcement databases. Once Mom realized his entire identity was fabricated, she'd started looking at his behavior patterns with new eyes and recognized grooming techniques used by financial predators. The way he'd isolated her from friends who asked too many questions, the way he'd positioned himself as the family's financial advisor while slowly gaining control of accounts and assets, the way he'd been unusually interested in Caleb's and my personal information, social security numbers and birth dates and mother's maiden names, all the data someone would need to open fraudulent accounts in our names. Mom had gone to police rather than confronting Greg directly, understanding instinctively that someone operating under false identity for years would be dangerous if cornered. The sheriff's department had begun investigating immediately, coordinating with federal agencies tracking David Hutchins across state lines. They'd been planning to arrest him at his supposed workplace after confirming his identity through prints and surveillance. But Greg must have sensed the investigation somehow, possibly through contacts in law enforcement or security networks he'd cultivated during his criminal career. His decision to flee that night had triggered Mom's emergency text to us, knowing that if Greg realized his cover was blown, he might try to silence witnesses or take hostages to aid his escape. The detectives confirmed what Officer Ruiz had implied earlier. They'd found evidence in Greg's truck suggesting he'd been planning to return to our house after loading his belongings, with materials including zip ties, duct tape, and a map with our aunt's address circled in red ink. The implication was chilling and clear. Greg had intended to use us as leverage or eliminate us as witnesses, and only Mom's warning and our immediate escape had prevented whatever violence he'd been preparing. Detective Cross arrived mid-morning with a forensic accountant who needed to document the financial damage for the prosecution's case. The accountant, a meticulous woman named Linda Park, walked Mom through the process of reviewing every account, credit card, and loan that Greg had touched during his time in our lives. What emerged was a systematic pattern of theft and fraud that had been incrementally increasing over 18 months. Greg had opened credit cards in Mom's name using forged documents. He'd taken out personal loans claiming joint income that didn't exist. He'd slowly siphoned money from checking accounts in amounts small enough to avoid immediate notice, but large enough to total nearly $60,000 over time. Linda explained that David Hutchins typically operated in cycles of 18 to 24 months with each family, extracting as much money as possible while maintaining his cover, then disappearing with a final large theft before moving to his next state and identity. We'd caught him at month 18, which meant he'd been approaching the endgame of his operation, which explained why he'd been pushing Mom for that business loan co-signature that would have given him access to a much larger sum. But the financial theft wasn't the worst discovery that day. Detective Cross pulled Mom aside for a private conversation that I could hear fragments of through the kitchen wall, and what I caught made my hands shake. They'd found evidence in Greg's belongings suggesting he'd been documenting our routines with disturbing thoroughness. Notebooks containing our daily schedules, lists of our friends and their addresses, copies of our school records and medical information he'd somehow obtained. The level of surveillance went far beyond what would be necessary for financial fraud, suggested someone planning something more sinister than simple theft. Detective Cross was saying words like human trafficking and false documentation, while Mom made sounds of horror and distress. When they emerged from the private conversation, Mom looked like she'd aged 10 years, her face pale and her hands trembling as she reached for both of us with desperate intensity. The scope of danger we'd escaped began revealing itself through the investigation's progression. Federal agents discovered that David Hutchins hadn't been working alone, but was part of a larger network of identity thieves and fraudsters who traded information and resources across state lines. His supposed security job had been a complete fabrication, but he did have actual connections in the private security industry through his criminal network, which was how he'd obtained access to surveillance equipment and databases he'd used to research potential victims and monitor his adopted families. The FBI found evidence that Greg had been communicating with associates about Caleb and me, discussing our schedules and activities in ways that suggested he'd been evaluating us for recruitment into their criminal operation or potentially for sale to other predators who paid for access to vulnerable teenagers. The revelation made me physically sick, understanding that every kindness Greg had shown, every moment of seeming care and attention, had been calculated manipulation by someone evaluating our potential value as commodities. Mom's sister, Melissa, insisted we stay with her for at least a month while investigators secured our house, and Mom worked with victim advocates to process everything. The extended stay gave Caleb and me time to decompress somewhat, though neither of us was sleeping well despite the safety of Aunt Melissa's home. Caleb started having nightmares about Greg appearing in his room, waking up several times a night in a panic that required substantial reassurance to calm. I found myself constantly checking locks and windows, unable to shake the hypervigilance that had been triggered by our midnight escape. Aunt Melissa got us both appointments with a trauma therapist who specialized in helping families recover from domestic violence and manipulation, explaining that what we'd experienced constituted psychological abuse even if physical violence hadn't occurred. The therapist, Dr. Ramirez, helped us understand that our reactions were normal responses to abnormal circumstances, that feeling paranoid and unsafe was a natural result of discovering someone we'd trusted had been systematically deceiving and endangering us. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks after Greg's arrest, and Mom decided we should attend to see him facing charges in person, believing it might help with our processing and recovery to witness him being held accountable. We sat in the courthouse gallery while David Hutchins, no longer allowed to use the name Greg Thornton, was arraigned on 17 federal charges including identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit than he'd appeared in our kitchen making breakfast and asking about our days, his performance of fatherly concern stripped away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. The prosecutor outlined the charges in detail, describing his multi-state operation and the estimated damages to dozens of families he'd victimized over 15 years. The dollar amounts were staggering, totaling over $2 million stolen through various fraudulent schemes, with our family being just the most recent in a long series of victims who'd trusted him with their finances and their children's safety. David Hutchins' defense attorney tried to argue for bail, claiming his client had cooperated with authorities after his arrest and posed no flight risk despite his history of disappearing when investigations developed. The prosecutor's response was immediate and devastating, presenting evidence that David Hutchins had been preparing to flee the country using forged documents and had been in contact with associates about transporting what he'd termed valuable assets, which investigators had determined meant Caleb and me. The judge denied bail without hesitation, citing substantial flight risk and danger to the community, particularly to his most recent victims who'd be called as witnesses in the trial. David Hutchins' face remained expressionless throughout the hearing, showing no remorse or emotion, just the blank affect of someone who'd spent years performing false identities and had retreated to some internal default state now that performance was no longer necessary. As we filed out of the courthouse, I noticed a woman watching us from across the hallway, her face drawn and tired but her eyes sharp with recognition. She approached Mom hesitantly and introduced herself as Rebecca Lawrence, someone who'd been married to a man named Michael Crawford 7 years ago, who she now knew had been David Hutchins operating under yet another identity. Her story was eerily similar to ours. Whirlwind romance, quick marriage, systematic financial abuse, and sudden disappearance when she'd started asking questions about discrepancies in his background. But Rebecca's story had an additional horror. Her teenage daughter had disappeared 3 months before Michael Crawford had fled, and Rebecca had spent 7 years believing her daughter had run away when she now suspected David Hutchins had sold or trafficked her to his criminal associates. The police were investigating the connection, she said, her voice breaking. But 7 years was a long time and trails went cold. She'd come to the courthouse hoping to confront him, to demand answers about what had happened to her daughter, but security had prevented her from entering the courtroom. Mom and Rebecca exchanged contact information, and over the following weeks they became something like allies in their shared victimhood, comparing notes about David Hutchins's patterns and helping investigators build the most comprehensive case possible. Rebecca's testimony would be crucial to establishing the full scope of his criminal enterprise and demonstrating a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond simple financial fraud into much darker territory. Through Rebecca, we learned about 2 other families who'd been victimized by David Hutchins under different identities, and a support network began forming among his victims, who were all processing similar betrayals and trauma. The FBI estimated that David Hutchins had operated continuously for at least 20 years, possibly longer, with some evidence suggesting his criminal identity theft operations had begun when he was barely an adult himself. The scope was overwhelming, suggesting a level of systematic predation that had destroyed dozens of families while enriching him and his criminal network substantially. The financial recovery process was complicated and frustrating, involving endless paperwork and coordination between multiple jurisdictions, trying to track down assets David Hutchins had hidden in various accounts and properties. Linda Park, the forensic accountant, explained that most of what he'd stolen from our family was probably gone, spent or laundered through his criminal network in ways that made recovery nearly impossible. But there would be some restitution from seized assets, and Mom was pursuing civil suits that might eventually result in partial compensation. More importantly, Linda helped Mom understand how to rebuild her credit and financial stability, providing strategies for recovery that would take years but were definitely achievable. She also helped identify warning signs to watch for in future relationships, patterns of behavior that characterized financial predators, though Mom said grimly that she probably wouldn't be dating anyone for a very long time after this experience. Caleb struggled more than I did with the aftermath. His trust in adults and authority figures shattered in ways that manifested as anger and defiance rather than fear. He got in fights at school defending himself against kids who'd made comments about our family being stupid enough to live with a criminal for years without noticing. His grades dropped as concentration became nearly impossible when his brain was constantly scanning for threats and processing betrayal. Dr. Ramirez worked with him on developing coping strategies and processing his rage at Greg for destroying his sense of safety. But progress was slow and nonlinear. Some days he seemed fine, joking and gaming with friends like a normal teenager. Other days he couldn't get out of bed, paralyzed by depression and anxiety that made functioning feel impossible. Mom arranged for him to transfer to a different school where nobody knew our story, hoping a fresh start would help, but the trauma lived inside him regardless of external circumstances. I threw myself into research about financial fraud and identity theft, needing to understand the mechanics of how David Hutchins had operated so successfully for so long. The psychology fascinated and horrified me in equal measure. The way he'd selected victims who were vulnerable due to divorce or loss, the systematic grooming process that built dependency and trust, the gradual escalation from small boundary violations to major financial exploitation. I read everything I could find about con artists and sociopaths, trying to identify the signs I'd missed, the red flags that should have triggered my suspicions earlier. But the literature made clear that even trained professionals often failed to identify sophisticated predators like David Hutchins, who'd perfected his performance over decades and understood human psychology well enough to manipulate instinctive trust responses. The knowledge helped intellectually, but didn't ease the emotional burden of feeling like I should have protected my family better. The trial happened 9 months after Greg's arrest, after extensive plea negotiations that ultimately failed when David Hutchins refused to provide information about his criminal network or cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. His defense strategy centered on claiming he'd suffered from dissociative identity disorder, that the various personas he'd adopted represented genuine separate identities rather than calculated fraud, and that he'd been as victimized by his mental illness as the families he'd targeted. The prosecution brought expert witnesses who demolished this defense, presenting evidence of his careful planning, his communication with criminal associates, his systematic theft patterns that demonstrated clear intent and awareness of wrongdoing. Mom testified for 2 days about how he'd manipulated and exploited our family, her voice steady despite visible emotional pain as she walked through the timeline of deception. Rebecca Lawrence testified about her daughter's disappearance and her ex-husband's sudden flight when questions arose. Other victims testified about similar patterns, building an overwhelming case of systematic predation. Caleb and I were both called to testify about our experiences living with David Hutchins, about his surveillance of our activities, about the night we'd escaped after Mom's warning. The defense attorney tried to suggest we'd been poisoned against Greg by Mom's accusations, that we were exaggerating normal parental awareness into sinister monitoring. But the prosecutor presented the notebooks David Hutchins had kept, showing our daily schedules documented with disturbing precision, our friends' addresses and phone numbers listed beside notes about their family situations, observations about our vulnerabilities and potential value to his operation. Seeing my life reduced to data points in a predator's notebook made me nauseous all over again, understanding that every conversation, every moment of seeming connection, had been him gathering intelligence while I'd thought we were building family bonds. The jury's faces showed clear disgust as they reviewed the evidence, and several jurors were visibly emotional during testimony about Rebecca's missing daughter and the evidence suggesting David Hutchins had facilitated her disappearance. The verdict came back after only 6 hours of deliberation, guilty on all 17 federal charges. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the prosecutor told us to prepare victim impact statements that would be entered into the record and considered during sentencing. Mom wrote hers in one sitting, the words pouring out in a torrent of rage and grief about the betrayal and the violation of her children's safety and the years of recovery that stretched ahead of us. I struggled with mine for days, trying to articulate the specific ways this experience had damaged my ability to trust people and function normally in relationships and feel safe in my own life. Caleb refused to write anything, saying he didn't want to give Greg the satisfaction of knowing how much he'd hurt us, though Dr. Ramirez said that refusal was itself a form of processing and should be respected. The sentencing hearing was packed with victims and their families, people David Hutchins had destroyed over his 20-year criminal career. The judge allowed multiple victim impact statements to be read into the record, and the cumulative weight of trauma and damage he'd inflicted on dozens of families was staggering. Financial losses totaling over $2 million, 3 marriages destroyed, multiple families displaced from their homes after he'd stolen equity and defaulted on mortgages, children traumatized and struggling with trust and attachment issues that would require years of therapy, and Rebecca's daughter still missing 7 years later, with evidence suggesting David Hutchins knew what had happened to her, but was refusing to provide information even with the leverage of sentencing considerations. The judge's face grew increasingly stern as statement after statement detailed the scope of destruction, and when it came time to announce the sentence, her voice was cold and precise. 23 years federal prison without possibility of parole, with additional charges pending in multiple states that could extend the sentence substantially if prosecuted successfully. Restitution ordered to all identified victims, though the judge acknowledged that full compensation would be impossible, given that most stolen assets had been hidden or spent. Lifetime registration as a fraud offender in states that maintained such databases, and prohibition on accessing financial systems or holding positions of trust over vulnerable populations. The sentence would effectively mean David Hutchins would be elderly if he was ever released, his criminal career permanently ended, his network of associates disrupted by the investigation his arrest had triggered. It wasn't enough to undo the damage he'd inflicted, but it was something. A recognition of the harm and an attempt at accountability within the limited options the justice system provided. David Hutchins showed no reaction to the sentence, his face remaining blank and expressionless as it had throughout the trial. But as he was being led out of the courtroom in shackles, he turned briefly and looked directly at our family sitting in the gallery. The look wasn't apologetic or remorseful, just calculating and cold, like he was still evaluating us for some purpose only he understood. The brief eye contact made my skin crawl, confirming that he remained a predator even in defeat, that whatever capacity for empathy or connection normal people possessed had never existed in him or had been burned away through years of victimizing others. Mom gripped our hands tightly as he was led away, and I felt Caleb shaking beside me with either fear or rage or both. The man who'd taught him to ride a bike and helped with his homework had never actually existed, had just been a performance by someone playing a role while planning to exploit or harm us when it became convenient. We returned home to a house that had been thoroughly searched by investigators and cleaned by professional services Mom had hired to remove any trace of Greg's presence. His belongings had been seized as evidence or disposed of, his space in closets and drawers now empty and strange. We spent a weekend rearranging furniture and repainting rooms, trying to reclaim territory that had felt contaminated by his occupation. Caleb insisted on changing his bedroom entirely, new paint color and new bedding and new posters, erasing every detail that Greg might have observed or commented on during his time living here. I understood the impulse even though I knew physical changes wouldn't erase the psychological impact of what we'd experienced. The house would always carry the memory of having been invaded by someone who'd studied us like specimens while planning to exploit our trust. Mom started dating again eventually, but with extensive background checks and verification protocols that felt paranoid until I remembered why they were necessary. She'd learned to verify everything, trust nothing at face value, require documentation and proof for claims people made about their identities and histories. The approach felt exhausting and cynical, but also necessary after what we'd survived, a recalibration of trust that acknowledged the reality that some people were skilled at deception and manipulation. She went to therapy regularly, processing not just the betrayal but also the guilt she felt for bringing Greg into our lives and exposing us to danger she hadn't recognized soon enough. Dr. Ramirez told her repeatedly that the guilt was misplaced, that David Hutchins was a professional predator who'd successfully fooled trained investigators and law enforcement for decades, but intellectual understanding didn't ease the emotional burden of feeling like she'd failed to protect her children. Caleb graduated high school 3 years after Greg's arrest and sentencing, and watching him walk across that stage felt like a victory over everything David Hutchins had tried to steal from us. He'd survived the trauma and the aftermath, had gotten his grades back up, had managed to rebuild some capacity for trust, even if it was limited and carefully guarded. He'd decided to study criminal justice in college, telling me he wanted to help catch predators like Greg before they destroyed other families, wanted to understand the systems that had allowed David Hutchins to operate successfully for so long. I was proud of him for transforming pain into purpose, though I worried about him carrying the weight of this mission into a career that would expose him to more trauma and darkness. But it was his choice and his path, and after everything we'd survived, I knew better than to try to protect him from his own decisions about how to process and integrate this experience. I changed my major to social work as originally planned, specializing in helping families recover from financial abuse and manipulation. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, meeting people in the immediate aftermath of discovering they'd been victimized by predators similar to David Hutchins, helping them navigate the complex systems of law enforcement and financial recovery and trauma processing. But it felt meaningful, using my experience to help others avoid some of the mistakes we'd made and connecting them with resources we'd had to discover through painful trial and error. I started a support group for families victimized by identity theft and financial fraud, creating space for people to share their stories and realize they weren't alone in their experiences. Rebecca Lawrence attended regularly, still searching for information about her daughter, still hoping that someone in David Hutchins' network would eventually provide answers in exchange for sentencing considerations in their own cases. 2 years after David Hutchins' sentencing, Mom received a letter from him forwarded through his attorney. He claimed he wanted to apologize, to explain his actions and make amends for the harm he'd caused. Mom read the letter once, then burned it in the fireplace without responding, understanding that engaging with him would give him exactly what he wanted: continued access to our emotional lives, continued power to hurt us from prison. Her refusal to play his victim was the strongest act of reclamation I'd ever witnessed, choosing to deny him even the satisfaction of our anger or forgiveness. We'd survived his predation and rebuilt our lives without his participation or input, and that survival became its own form of justice beyond what any court could provide. Some wounds never fully heal, some trust never fully recovers, but we'd learned to function despite the damage, to build new relationships carefully and protect ourselves better, to recognize our resilience in having survived something designed to destroy us. The nightmares became less frequent over time. The hypervigilance gradually eased into something more manageable, and slowly we reclaimed the sense of safety that David Hutchins had stolen from us. We'd learned that monsters are real and sometimes wear familiar faces, but we'd also learned that survival is possible and recovery is real even when it's slow and incomplete. Mom kept saying we were stronger for what we'd survived, though I wasn't sure strength was the right word for the specific kind of damage and resilience we'd developed. We were different, certainly, changed by experience in ways that couldn't be undone, but we were alive and together and functioning, which was more than many of David Hutchins' victims could say, and that had to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.